In 1972, a group of researchers at MIT sat before a room-sized computer and reached a chilling conclusion. Modern society was on a direct trajectory toward total collapse by the year 2040.
Decades later, a follow-up study conducted by a senior analyst at KPMG examined the updated data and found something even more unsettling. We are actually ahead of schedule.
When we look back at the grand tapestry of human history, advanced civilizations have existed for, at best, a mere 10,000 years. In that brief window of geological time, countless great empires rose from nothing and returned to nothing, leaving behind little more than dust, artifacts, and the skeletal remains of crumbling architecture.
While historians struggle to definitively pin down a single cause for any one of these collapses, the determining factors generally fall into four broad overlapping categories: political instability, social and cultural decay, environmental catastrophe, and the one that interests us most today, economic exhaustion. Any civilization that has been reduced to a simple entry in a history textbook fell through a toxic combination of these four factors. For some, the end was instantaneous, like the great city of Pompeii, buried in seconds by the fury of Mount Vesuvius. For others, it took weeks. The Aztec Empire collapsed after just 93 days of desperate resistance against the Spanish. And for some, it was a slow, agonizing decline. 300 years separated the golden height of the Roman Empire from its eventual messy disintegration.
Our modern civilization, however, is the greatest the world has ever known. We are hundreds of thousands of times wealthier and more technologically advanced than the most massive empires of antiquity could have ever imagined. If you are watching this, you have access to the internet, a gateway to a collective well of knowledge that kings and scholars couldn't have dreamt of just a century ago. We live surrounded by luxuries we've grown to take for granted. Climate control, worldwide travel at the push of a button, cheap clothing, life-saving medicine, and instantaneous communication across oceans.
We have safe food in abundance, water on tap, and the trivial luxury of listening to any song ever recorded whenever the mood strikes us.
People often ask me, who is the richest person in history? The technical answer is likely Elon Musk, or at least it was a week ago when his net worth sat north of $270 billion.
That figure fluctuates with the market, of course, but the point remains. People love to bring up the names of the past: Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, the Romanovs, or the legendary Mansa Musa. And sure, they were unfathomably rich for their time, but their time was one of universal, grinding poverty.
Despite their gold, they couldn't access the basic amenities you use every single day. If I were given the choice between my modern, rented two-bedroom apartment and a sprawling 15th-century French palace with no air conditioning, no indoor plumbing,
and a menu of food guaranteed to give me cholera, I would take the apartment 10 times out of 10. And honestly, you would be a fool not to do the same. And I haven't even mentioned the most significant shift: peace. Despite what the 24-hour news cycle or the front page of Reddit might suggest, we are living through one of the most peaceful periods in human history. This is not an accident. It is the result of a delicate synergy between technology, education, and global cooperation. Even nations that harbor deep, bubbling resentments are more dependent on one another today than the closest of allies were in the age of Napoleon.
Why go to war when you can get rich? It sounds cynical, perhaps even vapid.
but it is a powerful deterrent, albeit a fragile one.
Comparing our modern global economy to the empires of the past is like comparing a jet engine to a donkey. That isn't hyperbole. That is the literal scale of our progress. But herein lies the problem.
A jet engine is infinitely more powerful and faster than a donkey, but it is also infinitely less resilient. A donkey can trip and keep going. A jet engine possesses an incredibly complex network of interdependent components.
One tiny flaw in that network can render the entire machine useless. What's worse is that it moves so fast and flies so high that even the slightest hiccup becomes catastrophic.
Most of us alive today, especially those of us sitting in comfort watching videos on smartphones, would not know how to survive for very long if the supply chains failed.
We have grown accustomed to food being within easy reach, often delivered directly to our doorstep by an app. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm starting to sound like a doomsday prepper shouting from a street corner that the end is nigh. So, let's pull back and look at the cold, hard data.
How exactly did this MIT study predict that society would collapse? What measurable metrics were they watching to determine if the world was heading toward a cliff? And most importantly, is the fact that we are ahead of schedule something to fear? Or is it just a case of overanalyzing statistical correlations?
The original MIT study, titled The Limits to Growth, set out with a simple but daunting goal: to explore if our current consumption of the Earth's resources was sustainable. The short answer, it wasn't.
This study was groundbreaking because it was one of the first economic inquiries to utilize computer-driven system dynamics models. Now, I am not a computer scientist, but in essence, system dynamics is a way of using software to replicate the complex, messy workings of real-life systems.
Today, this sounds like common sense, but remember, this was the late 1960s and early 70s. Computers back then looked like massive beige refrigerators and possessed about as much processing power as your electric kettle. Despite these technological hurdles, the MIT team created World 3, a digital simulation of the entire global economy. This software modeled everything from population growth to industrial capacity. Crucially, it modeled how these variables interacted.
For example, a larger population requires more resources, more food, more water, more housing. But a larger population also creates a larger pool for innovation.
We have a much better chance of finding the next Tesla, Da Vinci, or Whittle in a world of 8 billion people than we did a century ago, when the population was only 2 billion.
There is a common joke among macroeconomists. Every single change you make to an economy changes at least 3 other things. Often, economists ignore this by assuming ceteris paribus, a Latin phrase meaning all other things being equal.
It's a great way to study cause and effect in a vacuum. If you tax soda, the price goes up and demand goes down, all other things being equal. But in the real world, nothing stays the same. The world is a web of variables, and World 3 tried to account for all of them.
The program looked at birth rates, farming technology, and industrial output. But because these things interact, they are prone to what we call feedback loops. Think of a microphone at a concert. If the mic gets too close to the speaker, it picks up its own sound, amplifies it, and creates that deafening, high-pitched screech.
The same thing happens in economies. Take declining birth rates. This leads to an aging population,
which puts immense financial pressure on younger workers who must fund pensions and healthcare through higher taxes. This financial strain makes it harder for those young people to start their own families, which leads to even lower birth rates. It is a self-reinforcing loop.
The MIT study tracked 5 key metrics: population, industrial output, food production, resource depletion, pollution. Keep in mind, in 1972, climate change wasn't the headline issue it is today. It was barely a blip on the scientific radar.
If the study were done today, global temperature would be a central pillar, but at the time, they were focused on the raw mechanics of survival.
To understand the data, you have to look at the hierarchy of these variables. Consider food and population. If one moves, the other must follow. But which is more concerning? A decline in population leading to a drop in food production, or a decline in food production forcing a drop in population? The distinction is the difference between a managed transition and a humanitarian catastrophe.
So, what did the report actually conclude? True to their profession, the researchers hedged their bets. They knew that predicting the future is a fool's errand. A revolutionary invention, like a viable fusion reactor, could be discovered the day after publication and change everything.
So they ran the simulation over and over, tweaking the initial conditions.
In some scenarios, they assumed innovation would stay constant. In others, they assumed technology would compound exponentially, making things like space mining or lab-grown food a reality. In others, they assumed we would hit a technological plateau. While a plateau might seem unlikely to us living in an age of constant upgrades, we are already seeing signs of it. Take Moore's law. For 50 years, computing power doubled every 2 years. But we are now reaching the physical limits of how many transistors can fit on a silicon chip. Maybe quantum computing saves us. Maybe it doesn't. Beyond technology, they tweaked birth rates, recycling efforts, trade levels, and resource discoveries. They tried to account for every realistic path humanity could take. And while the trajectories varied, they nearly all shared a grim commonality. They showed a significant, systemic decline starting around the year 2040. The researchers focused on a few primary outcomes. The first, and most optimistic, was the comprehensive technology scenario. In this version of the future, we continue our current lifestyle, but our technology advances fast enough to feed and house everyone. The model still predicts a drop in food production due to land misuse and pollution, but innovation solves the crisis. Population plateaus, but because of wealth and urbanization, not because people are starving. In this scenario, industrial output peaks and then falls, but we don't necessarily feel poorer. Why? Efficiency. Imagine a world of self-driving cars. We wouldn't need to own individual vehicles that sit idle 90% of the time.
One car could serve dozens of people. This is the "you will own nothing and be happy" concept the World Economic Forum talks about. It's not necessarily a conspiracy. It's a mathematical model of resource efficiency.
Then there was the stabilized world scenario. This happens if we maintain our current innovation but pivot heavily into renewables and recycling. It's a voluntary reduction in industrial output to prevent a crash. This was the most optimistic, realistic outcome. But then there is the business as usual 2 inches scenario. When the 2021 follow-up study examined our actual progress since 1972, it found that our real-world data points don't align with the optimistic models. They align almost perfectly with business as usual.
This is the collapse model.
In this reality, pollution continues to soar. Recycling never becomes cheap or widespread enough to matter. Industrial output hits an all-time high, but then the bill comes due. Food production craters. Famines strike the developing world while birth rates collapse in the West.
The lack of young workers kills industrial capacity, which further destroys the economy. Resources dwindle, costs skyrocket, and the jet engine stalls mid-flight.
By every metric, this is the end of society as we know it. I said earlier that I'd rather be a worker today than a king 150 years ago. But if this model holds true, I would rather be a worker today than a king just 20 years from now. That is a genuinely haunting thought.
Naturally, a study that claims the world is ending is going to face critics. Many argue the model is too pessimistic about human ingenuity. They argue that necessity is the mother of invention, that when our backs are truly against the wall, we will dump every resource we have into the comprehensive technology path.
We are already seeing this. There is a massive surge in renewable energy and green tech. We are still failing in areas like waste management, but we are light years ahead of where we were even a decade ago.
So, what happens next? If you're looking for a definitive answer, I don't have one. I can only encourage you to read the reports yourself. I want to be an optimist. I want to believe we can innovate our way out of this.
But I also know that my personal optimism carries very little weight compared to the research of 17 of the world's top scientists, research that is being vindicated by the passage of time. Best case scenario? This was all an overblown exercise in statistical modeling, and we can look back in 2050 and laugh about how wrong we were. The clock is ticking. Which future are we building?